All right, this is 16.2 quadratic equations, and now we're going to learn how to complete the square. I'm going to do this video in two parts. So we're going to recall how we factored what was called a perfect square trinomial, okay? So when we were looking for factors of 4 that added up to 4, so we're looking for factors of 4 that add up to 4, we know that that's 2 and 2. And we used to write it like this, but now we're going to write it like this, a quantity squared, so that we can apply the square root property. So factors of 25 that add up to -10 would be -5 and -5. And so we're going to write x minus 5 quantity squared. And then the last one, factors of 9 that add up to 6, are going to be 3 and 3, and we're going to write it like this, okay? So what we're going to notice is that the last term, okay, the 9, is actually half of 6 squared. So if I take half of 6, I get 3, and if I square 3, I get 9, which is right here, okay? So our goal is that we want to get a quantity squared. So we, whoops, that's a terrible sorry. So we can use the square root property, okay? So the first part that they ask you to do in Hawks is they ask you to fill in the blanks. So we're always going to be thinking of, if we kind of draw this little box, and why they call it completing the square is because we have this box, and what we're doing is that the first term is y squared, and then we take half of 2y, which is 1y, and put it on the diagonals, and then we square the number in front of the coefficient, and that's what completes the square. So we're looking for this, okay? And so 1 squared is 1, and that goes right here, okay? So we put this here, and then they ask you to finish it by doing your quantity squared. So y plus 1 quantity squared, okay? So again, we take half of this term right here, -8, and that's -4. We put that in parentheses, we square it, and that number goes right here. And notice that it is always going to be a plus, because if you square a positive number, you get positive. If you square a negative number, you get positive. And then they'll ask you to factor it as y minus 4 squared. Whatever this number is right here is going to match up with this number in the parentheses. And that's going to be helpful, especially when we get down to the bottom ones, when we have when we have odd numbers, okay? So now we're going to go here. We're going to take half of 5, which is just 5 halves, and then we're going to square it, which gives me 25 fourths, and that goes in here. Then when you factor it, you will have n plus whatever this number is right here, quantity squared, okay? So the next one is half of the coefficient in front of the y, which happens to be which happens to be -1. And that's -1/2. And then you square it, and that gives you positive 1/4. And so when you factor it, y, whatever this number is here, -1/2 squared, okay? So we're going to try these next two, okay? One's a positive one is an even number, which that's always nicer, and one is an odd number, which makes it into a fraction. So half of 18 is 9, and 9 squared is 81. That fills in the first blank, and then the second blank becomes y plus 9 quantity squared. Now we have an odd number, so half of -3 is simply -3 halves. Square it, and that becomes positive 9 fourths. That goes in the first blank. And then you factor it as y minus whatever this number is there, okay? So this is how we're going to use this to solve for completing the square. Here's the rules you can read through. But basically what we're going to do, I'm going to separate this into two parts. We're going to do the ones with even middle term coefficients first, okay? So step 1 is to isolate the squared variable and the single variable on one side. Okay, so in this case, it's already done for us, okay? We want the constant on the other side of the equal sign. So -8 is already on the other side of the equal sign. Then you're going to add a blank to both sides, okay? So we have y squared plus 6y plus blank equals -8 plus blank. And you're always going to be adding a blank, okay? Then step 3 is you are going to complete the square, just like we did in those last problems. We're going to take half of 6, which is 3, square it, which is 9, and that goes in both blanks, okay? So we're going to say complete the square to fill in both blanks. Now, step 4, you're going to factor the left side and simplify the right side. Okay, so when I factor this side, remember my goal is to get a quantity squared. So whatever this number is goes right here, and -8 plus 9 is 1. Then step 5 is use the square root property. So we're going to take the square root of the left and the square root of the right. Remember, this cancels each other out, and so now I have y plus 3 equals, as soon as you write the equal sign, you follow it with a plus or minus, and the square root of 1 is just 1. And then step 6, you're going to solve for the variable. So we subtract 3, we always put that in front of the plus or minus. Now, if you leave your answer like this, you're going to get part of it incorrect. You have to find the exact two answers if it is nothing but numbers. And so we have no square root signs, we have no i's, so all we have to do is find the two solutions. So the first solution is -3 plus 1, which is -2. And the second solution is -3 minus 1, which is -4. So when you fill this in to your Hawks, you are going to simply separate these answers by a comma, okay? All right, so let's try another one. Now this one doesn't have that constant over to the other side, so that's the first thing we need to do. And then we can write x squared minus 10x. I can go ahead and add my blank equals -23 plus blank. I take half of -10 which is negative 5. I square negative 5, which is 25. And that goes in both blanks. Then I factor this. So that becomes x minus 5 squared is equal to negative 23 and positive 25 makes 2. Now I take the square root of both sides. That cancels. X minus 5 equals plus or minus the square root of 2. And since the square root of 2 cannot be simplified, then I just leave it like that. And then last but not least, I move over the 5. And so x equals 5 plus or minus square root of 2. And since this is not just numbers, we have a square root sign in there, then we have to leave our answer like this. You can separate it, so 5 plus square root of 2 is one solution, and 5 minus square root of 2 is another. But I don't want decimals. I want a simplified radical, okay? All right, the next one, we have the x squared on one side, but we need to move over the 6x, so I'm going to add 6x to both sides so that I get x squared plus 6x plus blank is equal to 1 plus blank, okay? Now, I complete the square, take half of 6, which is 3, square 3, which is 9, and that goes in both blanks. So now I factor this group, x plus 3 in parentheses. Remember that number is always the same. And I simplify this. 1 plus 9 is 10. Now I can take the square root of both sides. This cancels. X plus 3 equals, followed by plus or minus the square root of 10. And then last but not least, I subtract 3. X is negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 10. So again, I can write negative 3 plus the square root of 10, negative 3 minus the square root of 10. I don't care how you put it. I think Hawks lets you do it this first way, and I think that's the easiest way, but just make sure that you have the plus and the minus in there because you do have two solutions. Okay? All right, let's try this one. So let's move over that 7. So we get x squared minus 10x plus blank equals negative 7 plus blank. We take half of negative 10, which is negative 5, square negative 5, which is equal to 25. And that goes in the blanks. So we're going to factor this. So that becomes x, whatever this number is, minus 5 in parentheses squared, and 25 plus negative 7 is 18. So take the square root of both sides. This cancels. X minus 5 equals plus or minus, and now I'm going to simplify as I go. So 9 times 2, the square root of 9 is 3, and the square root of 2 stays in the radical. And then last but not least, I add 5. So x is equal to 5 plus or minus 3 radical 2. All right, so we got one more, and then I'm going to make another video on odd middle coefficients. All right, so this one we got to do two steps. We got to move the 10x over to this side, and we got to move the 13 over to this side. So I'm going to get x squared, subtract the 10x, add your blank, and then I'm going to get negative 13 and add my blank. Now I can take half of -10, which is -5, square -5, which is 25. And that goes in the blanks. So x minus 5 quantity squared, remember this number is always the same, equals, and 25 plus -13 is 12. Oops. So now I take the square root. This 2 cancels that. X minus 5 equals plus or minus. I'm going to go ahead and factor that as 4 times 3. And the square root of 4 is 2. And the square root of 3 stays in. And then I'm going to add 5. So my answer is x is equal to 5 plus or minus 2 radical 3. So here are some just quick notes on how to factor this. This is not going to change. The only difference is when we do odd middle coefficients, we are going to have fractions. So I'm going to stop here and make the next video.